girls of her age. Part of this was the necessity of the case, for of course all the money went through her hands, and the household arrangements were guided by her will and pleasure. But part was her father's indulgence, for he left her, with full trust in her unusual sense and spirit, to choose her own associates and her own times for seeing them. With all this, Mary had not her father's confidence in the matters which now began to occupy him heart and soul. She was aware that he had joined clubs and become an active member of the trades union, but it was hardly likely that a girl of Mary's age, even when 2 or 3 years had elapsed since her mother's death, should care much for the differences between employers and the employed, an eternal subject for agitation in the manufacturing districts, which, however it may be lulled for a time, is sure to break forth again with fresh violence at any depression of trade, showing that in its apparent quiet the ashes had still smouldered in the breasts of a few. Among these few was John Barton. At all times it is a bewildering thing to the poor weaver to see his employer removing from house to house, each one grander than the last, till he ends in building one more magnificent than all, or withdraws his money from the concern, or sells his mill to buy an estate in the country, while all the time the weaver, who thinks he and his fellows are the real makers of this wealth, is struggling on for bread for his children, through the vicissitudes of lowered wages, short hours, fewer hands employed, etc. And when he knows trade is bad, and could understand at least partially that there are not buyers enough in the market to purchase the goods already made, and consequently that there is no demand for more, when he would bear and endure much without complaining, could he also see that his employers were bearing their share, he is, I say, bewildered, and, to use his own word, aggravated, to see that all goes on just as usual with the mill owners. Large houses are still occupied, while spinners' and weavers' cottages stand empty because the families that once filled them are obliged to live in rooms or cellars. Carriages still roll along the streets, concerts are still crowded by subscribers, and the shops for expensive luxuries still find daily customers, while the workman loiters away his unemployed time in watching these things, and thinking of the pale, uncomplaining wife at home, and the wailing children asking in vain for enough of food, of the sinking health, of the dying life of those near and dear to him. The contrast is too great. Why should he alone suffer from bad times? I know that this is not really the case, and I know what is the truth in such matters, but what I wish to impress is what the workman feels and thinks. True that with childlike improvidence good times will often dissipate his grumbling, and make him forget all prudence and foresight. But there are earnest men among these people, men who have endured wrongs without complaining, without ever forgetting or forgiving those whom they believe have caused all this woe. Among these was John Barton. His parents had suffered. His mother had died from absolute want of the necessaries of life. He himself was a good, steady workman, and as such pretty certain of steady employment. But he spent all he got with the confidence, you may also call it improvidence, of one who was willing and believed himself able to supply all his wants by his own exertions. And when his master suddenly failed, and all hands in the mill were turned back one Tuesday morning with the news that Mr. Hunter had stopped, Barton had only a few shillings to rely on. But he had good heart of being employed at some other mill, and accordingly, before returning home, he spent some hours in going from factory to factory asking for work. But at every mill was some sign of depression of trade. Some were working short hours, some were turning off hands, and for weeks Barton was out of work, living on credit. It was during this time that his little son, the apple of his eye, the cynosure of all his strong power of love, fell ill of the scarlet fever. They dragged him through the crisis, but his life hung on a gossamer thread. Everything, the doctor said, depended on good nourishment, on generous living, to keep up the little fellow's strength in the prostration in which the fever had left him. Mocking words, when the commonest food in the house would not furnish one little meal. Barton tried credit, but it was worn out at the little provision shops, which were now suffering in their turn. He thought it would be no sin to steal, and would have stolen, but he could not get the opportunity in the few days the child lingered. hungry himself, almost to an animal pitch of ravenousness, but with the bodily pain swallowed up in anxiety for his little sinking lad. He stood at one of the shop windows where all edible luxuries are displayed, haunches of venison, Stilton cheeses, molds of jelly, all appetizing sights to the common passer-by. And out of this shop came Mrs. Hunter. She crossed to her carriage, followed by the shopman loaded with purchases for a party. The door was quickly slammed to, and she drove away. And Barton returned home with a bitter spirit of wrath in his heart to see his only boy a corpse. You can fancy now the hordes of vengeance in his heart against the employers, for there are never wanting those who, either in speech or in print, find it in their interest to cherish such feelings in the working classes, who know how and when to rouse the dangerous power at their command, and who use their knowledge with unrelenting purpose to either party. So while Mary took her own way, growing more spirited every day, and growing in her beauty too, her father was chairman at many a trades union meeting, a friend of delegates, and ambitious of being a delegate himself, a Chartist, and ready to do anything for his order. But now times were good, and all these feelings were theoretical, not practical. His most practical thought was getting Mary apprenticed to a dressmaker, for he had never left off disliking a factory life for a girl, on more accounts than one. Mary must do something. The factories being, as I said, out of the question, there were two things open, going out to service and the dressmaking business. And against the first of these Mary set herself with all the force of her strong will. What that will might have been able to achieve had her father been against her, I cannot tell. But he disliked the idea of parting with her, who was the light of his hearth, the voice of his otherwise silent home. Besides, with his ideas and feelings toward the higher classes, he considered domestic servitude as a species of slavery, a pampering of artificial wants on the one side, and giving up of every right of leisure by day and quiet rest by night on the other. How far his strong, exaggerated feelings had any foundation in truth, it is for you to judge. I am afraid that Mary's determination not to go to service arose from far less sensible thoughts on the subject than her father's. 3 years of independence of action, since her mother's death such a time had now elapsed, had little inclined her to submit to rules as to hours and associates, to regulate her dress by a mistress's ideas of propriety, to lose the dear feminine privileges of gossiping with a merry neighbor, and working night and day to help one who was sorrowful. Besides all this, the sayings of her absent, the mysterious Aunt Esther, had an unacknowledged influence over Mary. She knew she was very pretty. The factory people, as they poured from the mills, and in their freedom told the truth, whatever it might be, to every passer-by, had early let Mary into the secret of her beauty. If their remarks had fallen on an unheeding ear, there were always young men enough, in a different rank from her own, who were willing to compliment the pretty weaver's daughter as they met her in the streets. Besides, trust a girl of 16 for knowing it well if she is pretty. Concerning her plainness she may be ignorant. So with this consciousness, she had early determined that her beauty should make her a lady, the rank she coveted the more for her father's abuse, the rank to which she firmly believed her lost Aunt Esther had arrived. Now, while a servant must often drudge and be dirty, must be known as his servant by all who visited at her master's house, a dressmaker's apprentice must, or so Mary thought, be always dressed with a certain regard to appearances, must never soil her hands, need never redden or dirty her face with hard labor. Before my telling you so truly what folly Mary felt or thought injures her without redemption in your opinion, think what are the silly fancies of 16 years of age in every class and under all circumstances. The end of all the thoughts of father and daughter was, as I said before, Mary was to be a dressmaker, and her ambition prompted her unwilling father to apply at all the first establishments, to know on what terms of painstaking and zeal his daughter might be admitted into ever so humble a workwoman's situation. But high premiums were asked at all, poor man. He might have known that without giving up a day's work to ascertain the fact. He would have been indignant indeed, had he known that if Mary had accompanied him, the case might have been rather different, as her beauty would have made her desirable as a show woman.